We ready?
Yep.
Eyes down.
Full house.
Well, anybody who's going to listen to this podcast, good morning. And here we are, the three of us, and you want to know who the three of us are. And I'm very happy to introduce Martin Kirk, who I've known since Noah left the Ark, a dear friend, always a colleague, and in opposition as a broker, and Dick Matthews, who I've known for not quite as long, but we've crossed swords professionally and socially for many years. And we thought this was a splendid opportunity with this all locked down for the best part of 3 months, with this horrific pandemic, which of course people of our age are more vulnerable than anybody else. And we thought, well, we've been through a few crises in our time, and they may appear to be sort of pimples or tiny little carbuncles in comparison to what we experience today. But at that time, they were crises. And we can go back to 1973 to the miners' strike, and we can carry it on to the time of the big crash in 1987. We can talk about the financial crash in 2008-9. There were also other little blips at the time of the Russian credit crisis and the Gulf War in 2003. So we've had plenty of them, and plenty of reverberations and plenty of activity, and not a little trouble in our time. So anyway, what I'd like to do is to introduce my two dear friends, and we will be adding other, how can I put it, interesting characters who enjoyed the experiences with us during the course of the last 50 years to come and join the party. Martin, good morning, dear boy. Tell us all a little bit about yourself, if you would.
Yes, I'm Martin Kirk. I left school at the age of 17. I joined Chemical Bank, which at that time was an American bank. It's now part of JP Morgan Chase. I left there and went to a stockbroker that did local authority broking, which was Phillips and Drew. And my boss at the time was Michael Cohen, who was a interesting character, should we say. I subsequently left there and went to Roberts Union, which was an amalgamation of a person called Bernie Roberts, who was a horse owner and bon viveur, and also Union Discount, which were one of the original discount houses. On from there, I went to Meridian, which was a startup operation, and subsequently became a director and 20% shareholder. And I was there from 1972 to 1988, which were interesting times because the Eurodollar market really blossomed. The Eurodollar market started off by what they call petrodollars, because we were all buying our oil from the Middle East, and it was going around Europe and also around the States. And of course, they had their own market that they operated, which were their own Fed funds. But the other dollars that were outside that market were called Eurodollars. The Eurodollar market really blossomed in the early 80s when the oil price really soared. And then the Japanese banks got involved. They got themselves domiciled in London, and at the peak there were about 26 of them operative in the market, and they dictated actually probably 50 to 60% of the brokerage that was paid in our market. And
could I just interject here, Martin, by saying, just to say, is that by that time, through the 70s to the early 80s, there were 300 trading banks in London.
Yes.
And as you so rightly say, driven by the Eurodollar market.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The it's actually as it's formulated since, an awful lot of banks have now amalgamated, and so I would have thought there are only in London probably about 60 players left, as compared with, as you said, 300 at that time. It just shows you that you know, big is not always beautiful, but the Americans always think so. But there we go.
Dickie, tell us about your future and your past. Well, I think let's move more here about your past.
Past.
Yes, a great future behind me. I, like Martin, started left school at 17, went straight into the city to Phillips and Drew on local authorities with James Jessamy, who you may or may not remember as my immediate boss, and Michael Cohen as well as my overall boss, who absolutely petrified me, and ended up years later working with his nephew Vic Cohen, who you probably both worked with at some point.
Yes, very much so, yeah.
I moved on after about 18 months at Phillips and Drew to RP Martin, which was out of the frying pan into the fire, which is a very fierce old foreign exchange shop at the time, run by Peter Shafto, who you may remember, Hugh Newcomb, some great luminaries there, and spent 8 years there doing some FX, doing some deposits, and then moved on to the life market when it opened in 1982, which I absolutely adored from day one. It was sort of like kindergarten for grown-ups, screaming and shouting all day long, great volumes, great fun, some great friendships, and some real market characters, which no doubt we'll touch on as we go through the day, such as the late Ted Urser, Nigel Ackerman, David Kite, Paul Hunt, my old colleague. And it was great fun, and stayed there for 15 years, I think, building up from a little brokerage house called London Commodity Futures, which is where I first came across David when Babcock's, was it Babcock's at the time?
Yeah.
And when Babcock's exploded or imploded after the purchase of Prebon, went on and built a business with Refco to be the, I think at one point, the largest futures broker in Europe, and certainly the largest on life. And it was great fun, and always enjoyed myself and enjoyed the market. And I guess the great days like 1987 and the scary days at the time were literally days, not like this time when it's been months out and doing nothing. And that's the difficulty, I think, not knowing for months on end. But I don't know how you guys feel on that.
I think talking, or having heard the two of you talk, I don't think we've got an A-level amongst us, have we? Certainly speaking for myself.
Only not me. Have you?
So anyway,
art.
Having destroyed my parents financially, having completely wasted 5 years of money, and Harry, my father was not best pleased. He took me to lunch at Gow's, and I didn't know if he was crying through his brown Windsor soup because his glasses were all steamed up, or whether it was just genuine steam. But wow, did I get both barrels? He said, I had such aspirations for you being a commercial lawyer in the City of London, and now you're going to have to settle for being a merchant banker. Well, I mean, that's laughable, isn't it, when you think about it today?
So, that was a money broker.
Exactly. Well, so off I went to Philip Hill Higginson Erlangers. And I have to be honest, guys, I learned probably more in that 5 years as a clerk than I've learned anywhere else in any other establishment. The grounding was fabulous. But the only thing was that you had been in penury if you'd stayed there. So I went out to lunch, one of my numerous lunches with R.P. Martin, and I was earning the princely sum of £900 a year at the time. This is going back to 1967. And somebody started flashing 1,500 quid at me, which was quite a decent increase in salary plus bonus. And so it was something I couldn't resist. So I said, thank you very much indeed. So my boss, a man called Robin Dent at Philip Hill, said, would I settle for £1,000 instead of 900? I said, you must be joking. So the following day, what I'd always wanted to do all my life was to be in the theatre or in films as an agent. And the following day, the phone went. I'd had a conversation with a chap called Robin Fox, who was the father of Edward and James Fox, the actors. And he worked for a company called London Artists, which probably people that you will remember, like Bernard Delfont, and those sort of characters, Leslie Grade, Lou Grade, and all those sort of things. And he said, I'm awfully sorry, but we've been terribly tied up with the takeover. We'd love you to come and join us at £2,500 a year. So I said, can I have 24 hours to think about this? And he said, well, we've taken 6 months. We certainly have 24 hours. So I went skipping home, told the old man, I said, all change, not going to R.P. Martin. I'm going to London Artists at £2,500 a year. He was sitting at the kitchen table. He put the Telegraph down very slowly on the table. He folded his arms. He said, "Could have sworn you came home last night and said you were going to RP Martin." I said, "Well, I did, but it's all changed. I haven't signed a contract." He said, "No, no, no, no." He says, "You don't understand. You've given your word. So either you go to RP Martin for a year or pack your bags and clear out, because no son of mine does that." So I said to him, "You're joking." He said, "Never been more serious in my life." And on went the horn-rimmed spectacles. We didn't speak for 3 months. The rest is history. So after 5 years there, I joined RP Martin. We've all been to RP Martin, the three of us, which is extraordinary.
Who was running RP Martin at the time?
No, I haven't.
Say again, Dick, I missed that.
Who was
I
running
haven't been to.
Martin at that time?
No, Martin and I used to meet for double egg on toast
That's
at
right.
Silvio's,
Yes.
which was in Moorgate, wasn't it, Martin? Do you
It
remember?
was, yes.
But I'd left RP Martin then, and I'd moved on. But that's the first time Martin left, and he won't mind me saying here, but he had quite nice, bright, ginger red hair, and it's not anymore.
No.
And I had quite a lot more, and I haven't got any now.
And you smoked a pipe, if I remember rightly.
Yes, I did, that's right.
I remember.
That's right.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. The woodpecker I was known as, do you remember?
Yes.
I used to tap it on that plastic ashtray, and everybody thought, "Oh, the woodpecker's in town." But anyway, moving on there, I've had copious jobs in the money markets. I've had the most extraordinary, wonderful time. I've met the loveliest of people like Martin and Dick and hopefully Graham, who'll come and join us sometime. And if I had my life over again, do you know what? Apart from perhaps being a little too magnanimous in handing out the largesse when I should have grabbed a bit more for myself, I wouldn't change anything. So anyway, let's start off. Martin, what's the first crisis you remember?
The first crisis was the 3-day week,
Yeah.
which was in 1973, which I was then at Meridian. We were working in King's Arms Yard in a basement there, and we had paraffin lamps. And you had to guess, because you could hear a sound from the dealer boards. You had to guess who was ringing you, because of course there was no electricity at the time. So,
But you didn't have I don't suppose you had a generator either.
no, we didn't have a generator. No. That would be too upmarket.
Yes.
But that was the first crisis, and then of course the next one was ID Herstatt. You may remember the small German bank that brought down quite a few other people, certain merchant banks in this country, and one or two other sort of institutions. But those are the first two things that I remember.
I think what I remember about that was a silly thing, but it just struck me at the time, is I think people realise the level of hardship. I had a really horrible little flat in Barnsbury where the damp was climbing up the wall. It wasn't the most wonderful place to stay, but I remember switching on the radio and listening to the Today programme when Robert Robinson and John Timpson were the presenters in those days. John Timpson was quite a crusty individual. And he said, "I don't know whether the Cabinet Secretary, Willie Whitelaw, would like to know, but the National Union of Mine Workers live at 215 Euston Road, NW1. And if they want the telephone number, this is it, and I hope they're listening, because we're all getting very fed up with this." Yes. Which was quite fun, you know, the way it was. But it did go on quite a long time.
Oh, it did.
And I think I remember, Martin, and Dickie will bring you in now, is Anthony Barber, who then was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I think probably wears the rosette as the worst ever Chancellor in living memory, doesn't he? He's got inflation up at 21%.
Yeah.
What sort of business were you doing, Dickie, then? Do you remember? Or was this before your time, old boy?
No, I was at Phillips and Drew. I can remember the key and lamp units. Do you remember those?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, yes.
You leave them open so the phone would ring because the lights wouldn't flash. And the hurricane lamps in the afternoon, because of course it was winter and dark.
Yeah. February. It was February.
We got through it because we didn't rely on televisions and Reuters. They weren't in the dealing room, were they? If you think about it. There was nothing.
Remember, I think the big journalist at the time was Patrick Sargent of the Daily Mail.
Yes.
I think he used to be seen in most of the watering holes in the City of London. Then there was Ivan Fallon.
Yeah.
Was another one who was a great journalist. And of course, at the time, if my memory serves me right, the editor of the Sunday Telegraph was Nigel, the old Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Nigel Lawson.
Lawson, yeah. And those were the main journalists at the time, but there was no communication. Reuters was just about there, but not to any great degree. And we were terribly reliant on the telex, Martin, weren't we?
Yes.
Getting information, do you remember, from Germany and from the United States and the rest of it?
True. It was a bit like football with the teletext, the sort of tapping away in the background all the time, wasn't it?
You could hear it tapping before anything came through, couldn't you? So,
well,
yeah.
absolutely. So let's move on, because we're going to get a chance to elaborate on this. When we talked about the Eurodollar market, Martin, in your introduction, which I found fascinating because it reminded me of so many things, and it must have reminded you of some of the characters. I mean, we used to have this chap who became hugely influential in the futures market, which, Dickie, you can talk about later. It was Henry Kaufman, who was the Salomon Brothers economist. So correct me if I'm wrong. And he used to be the great guru on money supply, or whatever Salomon was. They had brought huge influence to the marketplace.
Yeah.
And we had this thing about the measurement of money supply, Martin, didn't we?
Yes, which came out on a Thursday evening.
What happened? We used to go to the boozer, didn't we? I can't remember now.
Well,
Take us through. Yeah.
Quite a few people used to go to quite a few hostelries around the city, and then come back for money supply. But one or two were waifs and strays and never made it back to the office. But that was a sort of way. Every week you waited on this with bated breath. And occasionally, the Fed used to drop the discount rate, which really put the cat amongst the pigeons on occasions.
Tell me, that there used to be a huge premium on overnight dollars, didn't they, Thursday, Friday, and then weekend dollars you couldn't give away at some time.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right, because you were dealing with the likes of National Bank of Detroit at the time, banks that were outside New York, and therefore played a big part in this, like Continental Illinois, Chicago, and one or two other banks.
Do you remember Maurice Jacques?
Yes.
Illinois?
Yes, that's right. Tony Barber.
Yeah, I've forgotten him, yeah.
That's it. But those markets then subdued after all that sort of, and after that, it got back to, if you like, normality. But by which time we'd got the swap market, the interest rate swap market had evolved, and therefore that really made up for the lack of Thursday, Fridays and other sort of markets that we had previously.
I think one of the things I think we should comment on as we evolved going through the 60s, 70s and early 80s was the opportunity that was offered to people like the three of us who really let our parents down, if we're honest, in terms of our academic qualification, and gave us a chance to make something of our lives.
Yeah.
And most of our colleagues, Martin and Dick, were similar to us, weren't they? I mean,
right.
there were a few relative eggheads around, but not that many.
No.
And it wasn't really until we got into the sophisticated world of derivatives that the quality of academic qualification improved, was it? I mean, we were basically bon vivants, weren't we? We were people that were fun to meet in the pub and go out to lunch with or dinner with.
Yeah.
And that's how business was done. There was no such thing as a free lunch.
True enough.
Dickie, I want you to take me through some of the jokers in the futures market, which started really in earnest in '82. And please, could you tell anybody who's listening who'd forgotten how incredibly important futures were in the development of markets? It made the Eurodollar market explode, the sterling market explode, the Deutschmark market explode, Swiss francs until they became the euro. And basically for financing of foreign trade and for M&A activity, London was the place, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, certainly in '82, when the market opened, I think there was a general dismissal of the futures market as a Johnny-come-lately, a market which will never succeed. And probably for the first year, it was a very, very slow lift off. But eventually, I think it aided the swaps market, aided the FRA market as it was then. I know that we worked very closely with you, David, quoting prices and being able to read the market, which obviously helped when some of the guys were hedging. And I think it actually added a huge amount of liquidity into the market.
Massive.
Massive. And down a lot to the locals who were down there just trading their own books. And they really were the characters, some of those boys.
Tell us about the kites, the stretches, you know, all these Ackermans.
Probably the greatest was Terry the Till. Terry Crawley, a carpet layer from Bermondsey, hard as nails. And he started out with absolutely nothing. He's literally a carpet layer. He used to fill paper for me and absolutely hard as anything. He ended up making $1 million a month. And I'm not telling stories out of court. It was printed in the FT. They looked at his accounts, £1 million a month out of BTPs. And he stood there on his own until all comers on. He didn't care whether they were Morgan Stanley. I remember Nomura used to be scared of him. And absolutely incredibly quick brain. And funny enough, all he ever wanted to do was be a golfer.
Any charm?
Money.
Presumably he had lots of charm, did he?
He had zero charm whatsoever.
Really?
Yeah, zero charm, just a bully.
Oh my God.
Absolutely everyone. And then there was David Keiss, again, a very, very single-minded man who just wanted to succeed. And he did succeed. He's got a very large business. But the characters down there, Nigel Ackerman, one of the funniest people I've ever met, close on having Tourette's. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever been out with him and his wife, and his wife sits there with her head in her hands, absolutely petrified of him, what he's going to do. But again, an incredibly quick brain for working out back months and working out his position. I mean, fantastic. But there were some really funny guys, and it was a meritocracy, I think the word is. It didn't matter whether you had an O level to your name or whether what your background was. There was, Lord Danny Beckett down there standing next to, your mate Danny Andrews, who was from Bermondsey. And as long as you were quick-witted and you had an element of charm.
Danny Andrews used to make me laugh because he was as hard as nails. He was only a young kid, 18, 23 years of age. Absolutely terrified of the missus, wasn't he?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So, though.
Yeah, no, but she only had to answer the phone, and he got out of his chair and stood to attention. It was extraordinary. But he'd treat me, who was supposed to be a father figure, like a piece of dirt. It was terribly funny.
He was always charming to me. We gave him his first company car at 17.
I know you did.
I remember standing outside the old exchange in the Royal Exchange and seeing him turn up in his 3 Series BMWs, proud as anything. He gets out of it, and his dad's with him. And his dad gets out, walks around to the back, opens the boot, gets a bit of plastic out, and a coat hanger, and puts it on the back. And he uses the car as a minicab during the day.
No. Now, listen, before we move on, because we've got so much to discuss in the weeks to come, I want you to please tell us, in terms of market movements and influence, Salomons, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche, Barclays, JP Morgan, were they the big runners at the time?
Salomon,
maybe Midland Bank.
Salomon certainly were, and Goldman's. Barclays started to lose their influence once those guys, Salomons and the Goldmans, really got involved in the market. So
yeah, okay.
On the Hall of Fame, or the Hall of Shame, I don't know what you want to call it, must be Bankers Trust, must be up there.
It's got to be Mike Brewer and that lot, yes. Yeah.
And just on the edge of the first hedge funds were starting to come in round about then, in the very, very late 80s, early 90s, the first hedge funds. And my old mate Jerry Peel out in Bermuda, they'd have huge orders that they would come in and they'd take anyone on. And I think that's the first time that you could see change in the markets.
Before we move on, I'd just like to ask, because I think this is a question, Martin, this might slightly bypass you, but Dick will make Dick laugh, and I hope it'll make some of our listeners laugh, is that when pre-bond were bigger, eyes were bigger than their stomach, and they were consuming absolutely everything in buying ICH, which they should never have done. One of the things, of course, was the futures, which was run at the time, if you remember, by David Langton, and also others, you know. And one of their big clients was a fellow called Nick Jovanovich. Do you remember? Nick Jovanovich used to work for Morgan Grenfell, but he ran Captain Bob's money.
Yeah.
And they, I mean, talk about scalping. They used to make, I don't know, 10, 15 quid a round trip or something like that. It was an enormous amount of money.
Yeah.
And David Langton, who very sadly died aged 50, was one of the most delightful people I've ever met in my life. I said, David, there's absolutely no way, because if Midland Bank or any of our big clients find that you're running around as a local scalping people on the back of Nick Jovanovich, sorry, mate, it doesn't work. And we got rid of it very sadly. But your mate, Kevin Davis, didn't he? He was part of that crew as well, wasn't he?
Kevin was there, and Colin Two Chairs Taylor. Do you remember Colin Taylor?
Yeah.
He was there as well. And Kevin, I don't think he ever forgave me. We had to go to Paris, and we got on the plane, and I turned left and went and sat in first class, and he followed me. I said, no, Kevin, you get down the back, mate, get in the cheap seat. We went to Paris to see, I probably shouldn't say who it was, and Kevin had a wad of cash with him, and it changed hands.
And also, in terms of personal wealth, he'd eat you 20 times over, wouldn't he?
But, and I don't know whether Kevin will see this, he's dedicated his life to charity now, and he runs a very
charity
in New York. So, you know, hats off to him, but he was a nightmare to work with.
I want to just move on quickly, if we may, and go to what, to me, and I'd be interested to know from Martin and from both of you, actually, what I thought was the most significant years in the market's life was 1980. It wasn't 86 with Big Bang. I know we saw huge amounts of derivative trading and stuff like that, but in 1980 was the year that Thatcher abolished exchange controls, and virtually she opened the door to London. Yeah. And said, we're open for business. Do you remember, we couldn't take more than 50 quid out of the country per person to go on holiday. And when she said that's all over, that was absolutely incredible. It was, to me, the most important moment, because markets just mushroomed. Did you feel that in the dollars, or were you already on your way, Martin?
I think actually it, as you say, it really blossomed because you had all the big Americans coming in pre-Big Bang, and whether they were thinking it was going to continue, then Thatcher was going to do what she did, but they were already geared up when Big Bang came. So yeah, 80 to 85 was very busy.
It was the pulling the trigger, wasn't it? I mean, yes. Above everything else. I remember, I must actually just tell you a little story, which is, I've always laughed about it. I can't believe that I've ever heard it, and I know I'm digressing, but I think it's important because it just shows at that time how many politicians were so unbelievably naive. I mean, I used to run and work in a little outfit called London Deposit Agencies, which Dickie will know, and Martin, you know, but we were pretty Mickey Mouse. And you wouldn't say we were mainstream. So one of the things that I tried to do was to try and give us a little bit of a fillip by getting politicians into lunch. And we've had some extraordinary characters there. But the first lunch I had was from a very brainy but highly humorous John Biffin, who was the first secretary to the Treasury. And it was one of those lunches when somebody's got to say something, otherwise this is all going to die on its feet. You know. So I turned to him and I said, the measurement of money supply. And he looked at me, he was having smoked something, put his knife and fork down. Yeah. And I said, could I just suggest that you and Geoffrey Howe got this wrong? Because you don't include lending to building societies, and you don't include borrowing money into interbank market and lending it to Midland Bank Paris for a 5% return. So he put his hand knife fork down very gently, said, do you know who I am? And I started to feel the sweat going down the back of my back. And I said, well, I think so. I said, you're the member for Oswestry and you're first secretary to the Treasury, you're responsible for public expenditure. Oh, he said, you have done some homework. I said, yeah, a little bit. He said, what I know about the measurement of money supply, he said, you could get on my thumbnail. He said, why don't you ask Nigel Lawson to come round? You might know a bit more about it than me. So can we talk about something sensible now? So I thought, wow. So we didn't bother with Nigel Lawson. We rang Robin Butler, who I knew from school. And Robin came to lunch about 3 weeks later, and we went through this. He is the most charming man you'll ever meet in your life. And he turns, and I said, we go through the same rigmarole about the measurement of money. So I said, a bit technical for me. I'll send my colleague around next week if you like. So his colleague came around, lovely bloke, fresh down from Cambridge, Evening Standard in the hip pocket, cords, hush puppies, sports jacket, tied half-mast. Lovely guy, remember him like it was yesterday. So we went, he goes, So I said, so you get it, do you? He said, oh, I get it. He said, they don't get it because they don't want to. I said, right, okay, fine. But it's just extraordinary how we were all learning at the time, you know, extraordinarily to the time. So Dickie, Back to the Future in every sense. So the business was built up from 80 to 85. How badly damaged were you in 87, not as an individual, but was the market damaged? I imagine some people lost their backsides, didn't they?
Yeah. Yes, they did. I mean, that dreadful, probably the weekend before, because you knew what was going to happen. Because if you remember, Wall Street had shifted down quite violently on the Friday, and then we had the storm, and you know, you knew, or you had the storm, and then Wall Street shifted down, and you knew on the Monday it was going to be absolute carnage, and you spent the weekend worrying about it. We all had open positions, as we always did, because we never matched everything off. But actually, it was a enormously busy day, and it was the making of the futures market because we handled the volume and we got through the day. Still, to me, the most frightening day actually that I can remember in the city.
Can I stop you for 1 minute? In terms of the products, was it equity futures? Was it short sterling? What was it, or was it everything?
Short sterling and gilts really drove the market that day. Equity futures was still in their infancy. The US is obviously in the US, and I'm not even sure we had German bunds then, but it was really the sterling denominated contracts. But to me, still, probably because it was the first time I'd seen the raw terror of a market being out of control. You know, I don't think that we'd ever seen it before. Subsequently, with the ERM and other crises, oh, well, I remember 87, you know, I got through that, I can get through this. But that was a really scary day. But we ended up, we had a record day. You know?
Well, I'm sure you did. I mean, Martin, I mean, to the degree it was probably a little bit different for us because we were in the hard cash sort of side of things. But, certainly, you know, some of the things and the people that you and I used to know around the watering holes. I mean, for instance, IG under Stuart Wheeler and City Index under Johnny Spark were really dead and buried. But what was incredible about them was their diary of their contacts. And they rang up all their mates and said, look, you know, invest in this business while it's on the ground. Can you give me £5 grand, £5 grand, £5 grand, £5 grand? Johnny Spark got hold of Michael Spencer, of course. But otherwise, they were completely wiped out because people, as individuals who spread bet at that time, couldn't pay, could they, Martin? I mean, the movement was so violent.
That's it.
Do you remember anything from your perspective for that fateful day? No reason why you should, but I just wondered.
It's one of those sort of well, it was just a one-way market, and I think nobody knew where it was going to end up, and no. You had an awful lot of volatility in our sort of market, whereas the futures actually had another side to it. There was just a one-way trade, and so the business wasn't exactly that good that day, actually.
Well, no, because it was a bottomless pit, wasn't it? I mean, there's no bottom to it.
No.
We're going to end this session and hope that we've left an appetite for our listeners to come back and get some more, because we have got a mountain of stories to tell you all in the next few weeks with the RM in 1992. And I can't remember, Martin, but I think you and I were working at Babcock's at the time.
We were.
And I can remember from an interest rate swap perspective, that I think interest rates, because we got caught, and I wrote the biggest difference check I've ever done to the Hong Kong. I think it was 125,000, which sounds like peanuts today, but in those days, my God, we weren't exactly working for the biggest and best broker of the day, were we?
No.
It was a huge amount of money. I think interest rates in the long end of the market moved probably 5%.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about overnight. I'm talking about 2 years and 3 and 4 years.
True.
Because nobody actually knew what the devastation would be.
No.
Dickie, Martin, what do you recall of that day?
Dickie,
Was
you're
it pretty much. No, you, Martin. Sorry.
No, I mean it was just unbelievable, because certainly quite a lot of foreign banks just didn't know what to do and didn't know how to trade, and they were just kept coming on to you asking prices which nobody knew where the market was. I think that was the only problem that day.
I think we were lucky.
I don't think actually on that afternoon, you know, at the time, John Major's government at the time, and I just don't feel that anybody actually knew what the ramifications were. I spoke once to Tommy Fellows when he was the director of Gerrard, and he said pretty much the same thing. He said they had a funny feeling that all was not well. And I think they had a pretty...
I think that's an understatement, I think.
Well, Norman Lamont, of course, got the boot, poor chap, eventually in the end, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But probably in hindsight, Dick, I'm going to ask for your reflections in a second, but in hindsight, probably the best thing that ever happened to this country was getting out of the ERM,
yeah,
I suspect.
I think so. Absolutely. Don't you, Martin?
We had our boom time actually after that, didn't we?
Yeah, yeah.
Kenneth Clarke, and you know, we just went from
Strength
zero to heroes, really.
Yeah, exactly. What was it like on the floor, Dickie, and how much do you think people, just as we end off this session today, what was it like then, and how much fun do you think people are missing by it all being on technology, which I'm having huge difficulties at my advanced age living with?
It was enormous fun, but rather helped by having a very large Hungarian hedge fund trading through us. So we had Mr. Soros on the end of the line. So we were given a bit of a clue to which way the market was going. And we ended up having a fantastic day. And I wrote to Norman Lamont, thanking him on Bunker and my behalf for his generosity in helping us never having to work quite so hard again. Saw him years later, and he never thanked me for the letter. But no, I mean, it was an incredible day, and to be honest with you, the fun's out of the market as far as I can see. We had the best.
We had the best years, didn't we?
Yeah, without a doubt.
You can't have lunch with a computer.
No.
I'm sure we've all tried.
Yeah, Martin, I think we had the best years, didn't we?
Oh, without a doubt. One person that he's not in vogue these days, I always remember, because there was a Forex club, and we used to have Forex club meetings, and everybody went to hear Enoch Powell.
Oh, yeah.
And Enoch Powell, although he had very awful ideas on certain subjects, was highly intelligent, and he actually, I always remember, we were in Mincing Lane. As you know, there were two restaurants there, one on either side, and they were both full. It was full to capacity. And he actually said, when gold was at $770, he said, sell it. And he said, 2 years later, it'll be halved. And it was. But of course, subsequently, Gordon Brown, got carried away and sold the whole lot.
Sold it all at about $265 an ounce. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yes, unfortunately for Enoch Powell, who I got to know a little bit as well, but his rivers of blood speech in 1964 would be, by modern day standards, totally unacceptable.
True.
But at the time, he felt he had a point to make, and I'm not justifying it because of the current climate. You can't, but I'm just saying he felt he had a point to make. but his unbelievable grasp of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, we had I think you were there when we had a seminar. This was at Prevon, and the local authority sector was supposed to be having a seminar, but they haven't got any speakers, so they come running into me a week before and say, could you get a speaker? So I said, for God's sakes, I mean, this is hopeless. So anyway, I thought, oh, Enoch Powell had lunch with us last week, he might do it. So I rang him up. He's an extraordinary bloke. He lived in Belgravia. In those days, it was 235, and then the number, I forget what it was. And it always rang 3 times. Powell. And you'd say, good afternoon. He'd say, Buick. I said, how do you know it was me, sir? He said, I know everybody's voice. Extraordinary. And, you know, I just said, look, it's very short notice. Next week, we're doing this at Goldsmiths Hall. Could you possibly be our best guest speaker? And he said, providing I can choose the subject. And I said, what that might be? He said, the correlation between retail and wholesale interest rates. My heart sank, and I said, okay.
Enoch Powell and Tom McClenaghan. What a match made in
Oh my gosh.
Oh dear, oh dear.
We
Come
both
on,
worked with him, didn't we, Dick?
God, blimey. God rest his soul.
Yes, that's it.
Listen, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved every minute of it, and I hope anybody who's listening to this will plug in again. We'll certainly let you know when we're on parade again. And in the meantime, take good care. God bless you both.
Yep, all the best.
Thank you, David. All the best.
Cheers.
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 So, what do we